Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had a lively discussion in the breakout rooms. For those who just uh, came in, today is our third day of the International Conference on Philosophy of Education and Values Education 2023, with the theme of the future of education, teaching, developing, and empowering good citizens for nation building. So this conference is organized by the Philosophy of Education and Values Education programs of the College of Education, University of the Philippines, Diliman, and the School of Education, Indiana University Southeast. Yesterday and the day prior, we had a very successful conference, days filled with insightful presentations and workshops. And for today, of course, we have a very exciting final day prepared for everyone with our breakout rooms earlier and now our keynote lecture. Now, since we started the International Conference on Philosophy of Education and Values Education 3 years ago, we have been blessed with renowned philosophers of education as keynote speakers. In 2021, we had Dr. Marquez from the University of Auckland. Last year, 2022, we listened to Dr. Jackson from the University of Hong Kong. Today, I have the distinct honor to introduce our distinguished keynote speakers who will deliver their lecture titled Deliberative Critical Citizenship Education, What Can It Be? So our speakers, Dr. Maughn Gregory is a professor of educational foundations at Montclair State University in the USA, where he directs the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children since 2001. He is co-editor of the Routledge International Handbook of Philosophy for Children, and with Dr. Megan Jane Laverty, the Routledge series Philosophy for Children founders. He's also currently serving on the board of directors of the John Dewey Society and as the inaugural research coordinator for the International Council of Philosophical Inquiry with Children. Together with Dr. Gregory is Dr. Megan Jane Laverty, who is a professor of philosophy and education and director of the Philosophy and Education program at Teachers College, Columbia University, also in the United States. Together with Dr. Gregory, she edits the Philosophy for Children Founder series, including In Community Inquiry with Anne Margaret Sharp, Childhood Philosophy and Education, Routledge 2018, and Gareth B. Matthews, The Child Philosopher, which was published by Routledge in 2021. It's also the winner of the 2022 Book Award of the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia. She is currently serving on the board of directors of the John Dewey Society. Everyone, let's all give a big round of applause to Dr. Maughn Gregory and Dr. Megan Laverty.
Thanks so much, Leander. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you both.
Thank you, Leander.
Share my screen.
Yes, please.
Okay. All right, and Megan's going to begin.
Yeah. I'm going to do slideshow. Yeah, terrific. Okay, so first and foremost, thank you so much for inviting Maughn and myself to give this keynote. It's a great honor to be doing this. We're very pleased to be here to be sharing with you some of our recent research that we've been working on. And the title of our presentation is Deliberative Critical Citizenship Education, What Can It Be? And this title emerges from two distinctions that Maughn and I have been thinking a lot about recently. One is a distinction in method between deliberative and what we're calling ideological. And the other distinction is a distinction in content between what we're calling critical and conservative. And we think that the two distinctions give us four possibilities, which you see on your screen before you. And our thesis is that citizenship education should be deliberative rather than ideological, and politically critical rather than conservative. And we're going to make a case for this thesis by first exploring the distinctions politically, then thinking about them in the context of citizenship education, and finally thinking of philosophy for children as an instance of the kind of citizenship education that we think needs to be happening, which is both deliberative and politically critical. So I'm going to hand it over to Maughn now, who's going to explore the first distinction, which is between the deliberative and the ideological.
Thanks, Megan. Yes, so as she said, I'm going to talk just a little bit about this first distinction, which is a methodological distinction between what we're calling deliberative and ideological. And as Megan suggested, this distinction derives from political theory, but we think, so we're going to talk briefly about that derivation and then how it applies to citizenship education. So in very basic terms, deliberation and ideology are two different ways that we see power operating in communities. And we see this happening in all kinds of communities, large and small communities, like as big as a nation and as small as maybe a family or a workplace or a school, private and public communities, secular and religious communities, communities that lean to the political right and to the political left. So first of all, what do we mean by an ideological community? And let me just say, first of all, we don't necessarily think that any particular community is completely ideological or deliberative, but we think this distinction is helpful to understand different characteristics of communities that we actually belong to. So a community is ideological to the extent that power within it is organized hierarchically. And what that means is that people at the top basically decide the values of the community. They hold certain ideas and values inviolable, meaning that their interpretation and the way they're practiced, their implementation, is undertaken by authorities and their guardians. And ordinary members of these communities are discouraged and sometimes even punished for disobeying or even challenging them. And what this results in is a divide between people who adhere to those ideas and values, who are sort of like the true believers, and other people in the community who are identified as heretics, who have some kind of problem with them. And we're drawing largely in this particular essay on the work of the American philosopher John Dewey. And Dewey was concerned in the American context that modern technology and industry were making the American democracy increasingly ideological, where power was sort of concentrated at the top, both in government figures and in business, big business figures. And it was becoming increasingly difficult for ordinary citizens to understand and participate in the ideas and values that were being propagated from the top down. We also have this quote by Hannah Arendt that goes along with this. I'm just going to read it. She wrote that unanimity of opinion is a very ominous phenomenon. It destroys social and personal life, which is based on the fact that we are different by nature and by conviction. To hold different opinions and be aware that other people think differently on the same issues shields us from godlike certainty, which stops all discussion and reduces social relationships to those of an ant heap. A unanimous public opinion tends to eliminate bodily those who differ, for mass unanimity is not the result of agreement, but an expression of fanaticism and hysteria. Pretty strong. All right, so that was in the ideological community. And on the other hand, a deliberative community, in a deliberative community, power is organized horizontally, meaning that the ideas and values are first of all promulgated by ordinary people in the community, and then they are also understood to be constantly in need of reinterpretation and reconstruction. They're not just sort of like promulgated once and for all by the top powers and then never to be changed. They're understood as being constantly in need of change. And one thing this means is that agonism is expected to happen. So conflicts of belief and interest are expected to happen among the community. But we have faith that the intelligence of ordinary people will be able to solve the problems that result from this kind of conflict. This kind of community requires that there be many kinds of communication among its members. Many kinds and many types of communication is vital. A healthy communicative apparatus is vital. And this takes place not only in rational discussion, but also in action and experiment. So the ordinary members of this kind of a deliberative community, they will think together, they will discuss together, they will talk together, they will communicate, but they will also act on their ideas, and they will experiment with their ideas in action. So I will close with another quote. This one is by John Dewey, who wrote, "The fundamental principle of democracy is that the ends of freedom and individuality for all can be attained only by means that accord with those ends. The value of upholding the banner of liberalism is its insistence upon the freedom of belief, freedom of inquiry, freedom of discussion, of assembly, of education, upon the method of public intelligence, in opposition to even a coercion that claims to be exercised in behalf of the ultimate freedom of all individuals. There is no opposition in standing for liberal democratic means combined with ends that are socially radical."
Yeah, so
ask Megan to continue.
yeah, so I'm going to explore the distinction in the context of citizenship education. And so what we're going to do is characterize citizenship education as either ideological or deliberative. But we do just want to say that we see both forms of citizenship education occurring on the left and the right. So what characterizes ideological citizenship education is that it tends towards indoctrination, and it holds up particular teachings as unproblematic, whatever those teachings happen to be. And it reserves the interpretation of the teachings for just the authority figures. So the understanding is that to be educated as a citizen is to be educated in the teachings and to derive the interpretation of those teachings from those people in positions of authority. We also think that ideological citizenship education relies on rhetorical devices that are used to convey the teaching and to stir up emotional, if not intellectual, conviction for them. We'll say a little bit more about that when we come to the next slide. And it rewards and punishes students according to their demonstrated fidelity to the teachings. And related to that, you're included in the community to the extent to which you subscribe to the authorized interpretation of the teachings, and you're expelled from the community to the extent that you kind of challenge or hold an alternative interpretation or idea. So here are just some of the examples, and we see these examples happening in terms of content and method. For many of you, you will be familiar with the banning of books, which has been happening in the United States recently, particularly if those books deal with certain topics. There's been public presentations by figures cancelled on campuses. There have been closing of programs, the producing of textbooks that present politically skewed interpretations of history, and organizing mandatory rituals of patriotism. In the context of method, we see sort of questioning and discussion, contestation of the teachings or ideas or interpretations as actively discouraged, and any kind of disagreement is stigmatized. Therefore, inquiry is shut down, as is research, and opposition to the ideas and to their authority is punished generally by exclusion or by some form of, punitive measures. So deliberative citizenship education looks a lot different from the ideological approach. In general, it's derived from the norms and practices of communicative rationality, deliberative democracy, and discourse ethics. So it's associated with names like Benjamin Barber, Joseph Bassett, James Fishkin, Amy Gutman, Jürgen Habermas, Dennis Thompson, and others. It holds up particular moral and political ideals, but it takes them to be inherently vague in themselves and problematic in their relationship to other ideals, so that they can only be understood and practiced with ongoing intellectual inquiry. So even the ideals that are being kind of taught within the context of citizenship education are ideals that themselves must be inquired into, interrogated, and held up against other ideals. In the process of rigorous deliberative inquiry, students and teachers alike are obliged to problematize their own beliefs, commitments, and values concerning citizenship, but they're also obliged to interrogate and problematize the procedures of the deliberation itself. So even though the deliberative practices are the means by which citizenship education occurs, they are not themselves beyond interrogation or, if necessary, change. So there's adaptation internal to deliberative citizenship education. And this is just a great quote that we wanted to share from John Dewey, which I'll read. There is an important difference between education with respect to a new social order and indoctrination into settled convictions about that order. The first great step as far as subject matter and method are concerned is to make sure of an educational system that informs students about the present state of society in a way that enables them to understand the conditions and forces at work. If only this result can be accomplished, students will be ready to take their own active part in aggressive participation in bringing about a new social order.
Nice, thanks. So having just talked a little bit about this distinction between ideological and deliberative and coming down on the side of deliberative, now we're going to talk about philosophy for children as one example of a kind of educational program that is deliberative. So in order to do that, I'm going to just briefly talk about, for those of you who don't know philosophy for children, I'm going to briefly describe it in terms of these 5 ideas. First of all, philosophy. So in philosophy for children, we take the standard sort of, these are the sort of Western categories of how people understand philosophy in terms of ethics, metaphysics, aesthetics. We take these as dimensions of ordinary experience. These are not, in other words, these are not highly intellectual or esoteric domains of study, but these are actually aspects of ordinary experience of everyday people. So for example, everybody in your ordinary everyday life, probably today, you can think of things that happened that had an ethical aspect, that had a dimension of what's right and what's wrong, or aesthetics, what is beautiful and what is ugly, or epistemology? How can I be sure of what I know or what to do? And sort of the genius of the founders of philosophy for children was to recognize that these same domains of meaning are domains of the meaning of children's experience equally as they are of adult experience. So children's experience has ethical dimensions on the playground, on the school bus, around the dinner table in the neighborhood. Children have logical questions. They have epistemological questions. They run up against metaphysical beliefs and questions. They have to make decisions about ethics, about what should I do, and they feel very strongly about politics, about what's fair and not fair. They feel very strongly about aesthetics, what they find beautiful and ugly. So at the IPC at our institute at Montclair, Matthew Littman and Ann Sharp developed a curriculum, a systematic curriculum ranging from preschool through high school. And the curriculum was very unique and still is actually, in that it consists of novels, philosophical novels for children and teenagers of different ages. And each novel is accompanied by an instructional manual for the teacher that includes philosophical activities that can deepen the inquiry. And these novels, these novels are about experiences of regular, ordinary children. They are American children, so they've been adapted. When they're translated in different languages, they're also culturally adapted. But they are experiences of ordinary children running into recognizing philosophical aspects of their experience, and then inquiring with themselves and with adults about the meaning of those experiences and what difference it should make and how they act. In these novels, the philosophical ideas and concepts are pretty much on the surface so that they're easy to recognize, and it helps children and teachers sort of develop what we call a philosophical ear to sort of recognize and start to pay attention to these philosophical dimensions of experience. And maybe within the context of citizenship education, the political dimension of experience is particularly important. Wherever we go, there's power operating. There's people exercising power over other people for certain purposes and with certain consequences. As I said, the manuals have discussion plans, exercises, and activities to help us deepen our inquiry. The novels also try to represent different positions from the Western philosophical tradition on various issues that the children run into. There's no mention of philosophical names like Plato or Aristotle in the novels, but if there's an issue that comes up that different philosophers in the history of philosophy have taken different positions on, those positions will be mouthed by characters in the novel, so that in reading these novels, you get sort of an idea of the diversity of perspectives on these different aspects, on these different issues that come up. And very importantly, these novels model that children who start to think about philosophy and the philosophical issues in their experience and deliberate about them and start to make judgments about them, it makes important differences in how they're able to live their lives. So the way we actually practice with these novels is we form what we call a community of philosophical inquiry. And here's I think this was a third grade we worked with in New Jersey. And it looks just like this. We get in a circle, we read a little bit. Well, let me show you I think I have it, yeah. So we'll get in a circle, we'll read a story together, or we might act it out as a play. And then the students, having read the episode in the novel, they will raise questions that they think are worth discussing, that they feel are important. And out of the students' questions, we construct an agenda, and we decide which question to begin with. We start discussing it, then we have a dialogue. And the dialogue is facilitated by an adult who has sort of an expertise in the method of inquiry, being guided by critical and creative thinking, and following the inquiry where it leads, paying attention to arguments and evidence, and helping the children have a very productive dialogue. And from time to time, the instructor will introduce an exercise from the manual if she feels that will help the inquiry advance. And as the students begin to formulate judgments about the question that they've raised, they will think about how they can translate their judgments into an action project or an art project. And we always want to self-assess as a community of inquirers. The students will assess their own philosophical progress and their own functioning as a community of inquiry. Like, how did we How did we do today? Did a few people do most of the talking, or did a lot of people get to participate? Was it very interesting? Did we get anywhere? Did we challenge our own thinking? Were we thinking carefully? Those kinds of things.
Great. So I'm going to just reiterate, I'm sure those of you who were listening to Maughn could hear the connections between what we were speaking about in terms of deliberative citizenship education and philosophy for children. So just to reiterate some of those, first of all, philosophy for children by way of the curriculum relates concepts and values of Western political thought to children's experience. So it gives them ideas and language with which to think about the political dimensions of their experience. But it also problematizes those ideas. So it's not offering those ideas from a position on high. It's not using the argument from authority. There are not names like Plato and Aristotle mentioned. These ideas come from characters in the novels who are the same age as the children themselves. And it's the children in the novels talking together about these concepts and exploring them in multifaceted ways and struggling to make sense of them together. It also involves critical thinking, as we'll talk about more when we move to the next slide, I think. Is that right, Maughn? Yeah. And then the community of inquiry, of course, is the sort of deliberative mechanism by which the community takes into account both the questions that arise from the novel and problems that arise within the context of discussing those questions, and also the ways in which they deal with problems that occur in the context of exercising the principles of the community of inquiry. So hence the self-evaluation. How are we doing? Did everyone speak today? Is there something we need to do differently? Also, perhaps, most strikingly, and particularly in response to one of the questions that's come up in the chat, children are, according to Philosophy for Children and the ages with which these students begin doing this work, it's assumed that they are as much social critics as adolescents and adults, that they're invested and involved and aware in ways that we are. And also it's committed to educational reform. It's committed to aligning what's happening in schools more and more with this deliberative model of citizenship education. So it's interested in opportunities for schools to adapt and change and accommodate some of these features. So this is the point about critical thinking. Critical thinking's sort of very important, both as an ingredient of deliberative citizenship education and also as an ingredient of philosophy for children. And Matthew Lippmann had a very kind of deep and sophisticated theory of critical thinking. He thought that critical thinking clearly had to appeal to relevant criteria, but that it was directed at a product, at developing a product. It was purposeful in the sense that it was seeking to move to saying something, making something, or doing something. And it was about the use of knowledge to bring about reasonable change. It was sensitive to particulars and the uniqueness of situations. It was complemented by creative and caring thinking. Caring thinking here being thinking about what matters most. And it was self-corrective in the ways that we have talked about, that the community enabled the thinking as much as the procedures to be self-corrected when practiced together. And this is just a lovely quote that we wanted to read for you from Anne Sharp on the community of inquiry that reflects our sense of it as highly deliberative. So she says, the commitment to engage in a community of inquiry is a political commitment, even at the elementary school level. In a real sense, it is a commitment to freedom, open debate, pluralism, self-government, and democracy. Political praxis that is communal, involving practical reason, reflective inquiry, and practical judgment, presupposes that citizens have a facility with inquiry and dialogue, shared understandings and experiences, intersubjective daily practices, a sense of affinity and solidarity, together with all the other tacit affective ties that bind people together in a community, are preconditions of communal reflective action in the political sphere. Oh, this was me too. Yeah, so I've talked a little bit about this, just that involving children more in school governance, also seeking to be deliberate in diversifying the voices. Sometimes a community of inquiry in a school is not always diverse, particularly if the school is predominantly, one ethnicity or one religion. And so how do you bring different voices into the community so that that community is genuinely inclusive in the ways it needs to be if it's properly deliberative? And also there's work being done within philosophy for children to pay more attention to the politics of discourse. So when we self-evaluate and we ask questions like, how are we doing? Who's doing all the speaking? Sometimes that involves thinking about, is it the boys or is it the girls? And why might that be the case? And what do we need to think about and understand and know in order to properly address some of the gender divisions that occur and some of the racial divisions and class divisions that occur within a community of inquiry? And also just combining more and more philosophical inquiry with action projects that take the inquiry out into the social world.
This photograph, you might recognize Jane Goodall there on the right, and the woman standing in the middle was a school teacher that did her doctoral degree with us at Montclair, and she was doing philosophy with her young students. I think they were a third or fourth grade, and they were doing one of the novels that deals with philosophy of nature, and the children started to look around and recognize that the public school that they were in owned a lot of land, and the land had been converted into mostly green lawns, which they were starting to recognize was not really conducive for local species. And so the children started to inquire about that and started to worry about, what does this mean for local species and local habitat? And they began an action project in which they asked for experts to come in and talk to them about what were native species of plants and animals in their New Jersey area, and what was the impact on them of what the school had done to its land. And they designed a reconstruction of their school land, and they realized it would take a lot of money. And so they, with their families and with the whole school, they got people involved in different projects to raise money. And they actually redesigned the entire school as a natural habitat with only local native species of plants that would attract local native animal species. And they were so successful, they were recognized by the Jane Goodall Institute as having done something very significant. So that's just one kind of dramatic example of how we think, we hope that philosophical inquiry doesn't, especially in the context of citizenship education, doesn't begin and end with just thinking and talking, but it actually moves into experimental action. And when we experiment with our actions, then we have to then deal with the consequences and bring those consequences back into the inquiry circle and decide how to deal with them. Okay, so now we're going to speak briefly about the second distinction that we talked about at the beginning, and this is between critical and conservative. And this has more to do with content. So I'm going to begin with this quote by the philosopher Richard Rorty that kind of explains this distinction. So he wrote that the word democracy has gradually come to have two distinct meanings. In its narrower, minimalist meaning, it refers to a system of government in which power is in the hands of freely elected officials. I shall call democracy in this minimal sense constitutionalism. In its wider sense, it refers to a social ideal, that of equality of opportunity. In this second sense, a democracy is a society in which all children have the same chances in life, and in which nobody suffers from being born poor, or being the descendant of slaves, or being female, or being homosexual. I shall call democracy in this sense egalitarianism. In theory, a country could remain a constitutional democracy even if its government never instituted any measures to increase equality of opportunity. So we're sort of using this distinction Rorty makes between constitutionalism, which we're calling conservative democracy, and egalitarianism, which we're calling critical. So conservative citizenship education. In conservative citizenship education, it does promote those democratic civic values that Rorty mentioned, including, for example, free election, the separation of powers in a government, a certain sphere of civil rights, like freedom of speech, maybe freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the separation of federal, state, and national governments, and certain rights and obligations of citizens and individuals. And taken together, this view of what he calls minimalist democracy, we're saying it's already not neutral. In other words, compared to totalitarian visions of society and fascist or communist visions of society, this kind of democratic vision of society is a particular value system. So conservative, what we're calling conservative citizenship education in the democratic context is still a value commitment. But it's different from critical citizenship education, which, first of all, it presumes the content of traditional civics education that we just iterated in the previous slide. So we've got all of those freedoms and government institutions in place. But as Rorty said, you can have all those things in place and never do anything toward more equality among the citizens. So critical citizenship education educates, first of all, for those institutions and those values, but it adds to that the study of issues of oppression and injustice. And the traditional categories that people are studying include racial injustice, injustice based on class, on gender, on sexuality, age, ability, and many other categories. And it studies these kinds of oppression as both kinds of oppression that happen among individuals, but also as happens structurally and systematically. And it works toward the cultivation of intelligent sympathy in citizens and students. So here's another great quote from John Dewey about this. And I think Dewey here was writing like in the 1930s, and we're just like shocked and delighted about, or maybe appalled about how it applies today. If the average boy and girl could be walled off from all ideas and information about social affairs, save those acquired in school, they would enter upon the responsibilities of social membership in complete ignorance that there is any social problems, any political evils, any industrial defects. They would go forth with the supreme confidence that the way lies open to all, and that the sole cause of failure in business, family life, or citizenship lies in some personal deficiency in character. The school is even more indurated from a frank acknowledgement of social ills than the pulpit, which is saying a good deal. And like the pulpit, it compensates for its avoidance of discussion of social difficulties by a sentimental dwelling upon personal vices. So back to Megan.
Okay, so we think that philosophy for children is an example of critical citizenship education, as well as being an example of deliberative citizenship education. So what makes it critical? It's critical because it does explain, but also problematizes features of American government and society. And of course, you know, Matt and Anne were thinking about a citizenship education program for citizens of the United States, and they wrote the novel Mark, which you can see in the slide. But of course, this novel has been adapted for different contexts. So basically, in different cultural contexts, it does the same thing, but the form of government is different. It's interesting too to keep in mind that Matthew Lipman, before he moved to Montclair State University and became the founder or the co-founder of what is now known as the Philosophy for Children movement, he spent many years teaching in Columbia University's core curriculum. He also taught general education at Columbia University's College of Pharmacy. And the purpose of the core curriculum, particularly a course called Western Civilization, is to expose students to texts in the history of thought that tackle social, political, and economic subject matter with a view to enabling them to talk in an informed and thoughtful way about some of the issues that they're facing in their own lives. So it was intended to raise social and political awareness and also broaden the scope of their understanding. We also think of it as critical citizenship education because it raises issue of gender, discrimination, race, minority groups in society, stratification, status, class, and caste. So you'll find those issues in the IAPC curriculum that Maughn spoke about, but you'll also see that, that there is specific curriculum developed to address specific topics like gender or like minority groups in society. And you'll see some of the titles there. They deal with immigration, child arranged marriage, sexual abuse, sexual orientation, AIDS, and sexual politics. So it's doing the things Maughn mentioned. It's tackling issues of injustice, and it's seeking to develop sympathy for those who are the victims of injustice. We wanted to end our presentation with this list of qualities that Anne Margaret Sharp used to describe children as good social critics. And I think it sort of beautifully responds to the question that was asked by Abigail in the chat, because it's she's sort of keen to emphasize that any good citizenship education program is going to be deliberative and critical. And by virtue of being deliberative and critical, it's going to produce or encourage children to be good social critics or support them in their social criticism. And the deliberative features are that we have to keep looking at situations from different perspectives and tolerate different viewpoints, even if we all collectively pretty much share the same point of view. We have to do the work to open ourselves to different viewpoints. We offer our insights as hypotheses that require testing. We think critically, creatively, and caringly together, but also with great compassion. We try and keep in mind the most vulnerable populations that that are often not heard in the context of thinking about many of these issues. We practice intellectual humility, and we build on the ideas of others in a cooperative way. So the idea too there is that we might leave thinking something different than what we entered with. But the critical piece is there too. We've got to make sure that we diversify our community by engaging with others in our society. We have to consciously and deliberatively consider the suffering of others, identify who are the victims of individual structural and systemic oppression. We have to cultivate critical virtues such as courage, compassion, and good judgment. And we have to expose injustice and gather necessary information to discuss it intelligently. And I think last but not least, we have to be imaginative. We have to think of new policies, categories, institutions, and relationships that might render a better world. We can't be satisfied with the status quo. So we're going to end the talk there. We're hoping we have a few minutes to address some of the terrific questions that have come up in the chat. I'm going to hand over to Maughn perhaps to answer one or more of them.
I've actually, since I'm sharing screen, I've not been able to see any of the chat, so I'll close. And then I'll be able to look at them with you. I just wanted to, if people are interested in our institute and want to like maybe share some things with us, we have a Facebook page. You're welcome to see what we're doing and join some of our activities. So let me end here.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gregory and Dr. Laverty, Maughn, Megan, for that wonderful presentation. It brings back a lot of beautiful memories from our training at IETC 6 years ago. Okay, so yeah, we have several questions in the chat. And okay, I'll read the first question. The first question came from Arthur Villasor. Maybe this can be tied with the second question from Von Catindoy because he has a follow-up question to that. So according to Arthur Villasor, there are positive factors that can help institute our education along the democratic social consciousness. Do you agree to rely more on philosophical foundations based from the Constitution, from its preamble and mandate? So a follow-up to that is, according to Von Catindoy, I'd like to build on the preceding question. When we form or develop our children, don't we start ideologically and gradually transition them to deliberative thinking, much like how we teach moral discernment a la Kohlberg?
Okay, I'll offer something, and Maggie, you can jump in. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with your Constitution and preamble, but if it's anything like ours, I would say that the deliberative approach would be to teach that these are the values enshrined in these documents, and this is where they came from. These are the people who created them. This is what they were thinking at the time, and open that up to see what for the evaluation of students, current students today. And as to the question of how young we do that, I think that we would say we do that as young as students are able to raise questions about them. In a sense, yes, we do. I think in parenting and in teaching, sometimes we have to begin ideologically, just in the sense that we live the way we live and our children see the way we live and they see the way we practice. And we're not always self-conscious about it. We don't always open up everything we do for discussion. So in that sense, we are sort of beginning ideologically, but we want to always encourage questioning from the youngest age possible. As soon as children are old enough to answer questions, we want the deliberation to begin. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Megan?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I have nothing to add.
Okay, thanks. So, next question we have from Mike Muega. Agonism has been keeping me busy recently. How would you describe the relationship between deliberative citizenship education and agonism? Are they overlapping concepts or one is a subset of the other? Can you recommend some readings that discuss the relationship between deliberative citizenship education and agonism? Thank you, Profs. Gregory and Laverty.
Yes, so I'll answer this. I'm not sure that I'm answering this in an informed way. That is, I have not been kept so busy with agonism recently. But the way I think about the relationship is that agonism is kind of necessary. It's a necessary element of deliberative citizenship education. It's almost like if there's no agonism, then I would be suspicious about whether there really is deliberative citizenship education, because I think that internal to being deliberative is the raising of different viewpoints and the seeking out of different viewpoints and the weighing up of those different, bringing those different viewpoints into conversation with one another. And in fact, I think for sort of Maughn and I, at least, this is one of the things we want to see, even when citizenship education is critical as well. So sometimes when we move to talking about injustices, the agonism can drop away because we all feel that we want to be on the right side of history or be on the right side of the debate or be aligned with what we take to be the right view. And I think part of what motivated this project is that even when we're discussing injustice, structural and systemic, we want to maintain a commitment to the possibility of agonism and debate and deliberation.
Thank you.
And
Maughn, anything? Sorry.
I just don't know any readings off the top of my head, but I can certainly think about it. Maughn might know a reading.
The only thing I would add is that the way we conceive of inquiry depends on a certain kind of agonism, but also expects that the agonism will be in the service of the search for the best judgment, the search for the most reasonable outcome. So we want to gather many different points of view, including conflicting and agonistic points of view, but we want everybody who brings their point of view to the inquiry to bring it with the idea that this is the idea I begin with, but I want to be able to self-correct to find in the direction of the most reasonable judgment. And agonism is necessary for that, but not sufficient, maybe.
Nice.
Thank you. For the next question, you've covered this in your presentation earlier, but maybe you'd like to add something more. So from Abigail Canuto, genuinely open and philosophical dialogues indeed develop social, emotional, and cognitive competencies in ways that much less deliberative and disciplined classroom discourses might not be able to. One of the most challenging things in such dialogues, however, include the emergence of controversial topics and ideas that the teacher might personally feel strongly about or against, or the teacher might think children are not ready to talk about. How would you, for example, navigate the deliberative dialogue around difficult topics such as war, death, existence or non-existence of God, poverty, climate change, and others? Can the dialogue truly, genuinely remain open and deliberative when it comes to difficult topics like these? What specific suggestions would you have for teachers so that despite the challenge of navigating topics like these, the dialogue remains genuinely open and deliberative?
That's a great question.
Mm.
And there's no such thing as a simple answer to a question like this. I want to just reiterate or remind people of what Dewey said about the means and the ends when he said that you can't, if the outcome you want is an open deliberative community, you can't get there by saying, well, I have to take over and control the dialogue when controversial issues come up because the stakes are too high. But then once we get beyond that, I'll let the community be open and deliberative again. That just doesn't work, because they only learn how to deal with things in a deliberative way by dealing with them. And in terms of the age of the children, I really trust children to tell us the extent to which issues like God and poverty and climate change are meaningful enough in their own lives that they need to talk about them, and the level and the extent to which they need to talk about these things. You know, the way that children talk about, the way that 5-year-olds talk about God in a very deliberative, intense way is different from the way teenagers talk about it. So I like to take the lead from children. Megan, do you want to add? You want to jump in?
Yeah, I think the thing I would add is I would just echo Maughn and say I think this is such a great question, and I don't think there is a simple answer. But I think within the context of my own thinking about it, one of the things that's emerged for me is that, and it relates to what Maughn just said, that I think sometimes the anxiety that is around these topics comes from the adult. As adults, we have a lot of anxiety around controversial topics. And I think if we can kind of contain that anxiety, or at least bracket it or hold it for a length of time, then it allows us to just listen. And I think if we can just listen, like Maughn says, we can sort of trust the kids to tell us how they're needing to think about it in the context of their own lives, and to ask questions that they have. And then I think we can be more responsive. But I think we have to let go a little bit. I think there's, you know, that's just something has helped me in thinking about how to do this better. Yeah.
The only gray area I see here that I don't see an easy answer to is if there are children in the community whose, let's say, perhaps whose indoctrination might move them to speak in ways that are oppressive within the community. Like, for example, to use racist language, or to start criticizing somebody else's religion or gender. While those issues do need to be discussed, if they start to be discussed in a way that becomes oppressive and it shuts down the community, then I think the teacher has to step in and not allow that. Not because the teacher has the right answer or wants to tell the children what the answer is, but because of what we said before about the politics of discourse. The teacher has to be the guardian of the politics of discourse to keep it safe and democratic for everybody.
Yeah, and I think one thing too, rereading the question, that I think is something that we were thinking about in the context of the talk, is that we like the idea of deliberative and critical, because we think that sometimes seeking to be deliberative like, we don't want the teacher to feel that in seeking to be deliberative, we're seeking to be neutral, right, or we're seeking not to be comfortable with sharing certain kinds of values or commitments. I think we want to be able to do both. We want to be able to be deliberative, but also kind of working through what kinds of values we want to have and what it means to have those values.
Thank you. We have some more questions. So from Franz Cortez, how do you distinguish critical citizenship education to another North American educational tradition, that is critical pedagogy? Do you view them as also trapped in the language of ideology that you also discussed? Thank you. Maughn can answer this, I think.
Well, the simple answer would be no. Like if it's a categorical response, no, I don't see them as trapped in ideology. I think, and it's not only the program, it's not only the curriculum, it's really the way that they're sort of implemented. Are they sort of implemented in an ideological, indoctrinatory way, or are they implemented in a deliberative kind of way? Certainly, what I've read of these authors, particularly Bell Hooks, I mean, and she was a devotee of Freire, which was completely deliberative. So I think that I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap in what we're presenting and the tradition of critical pedagogy. What would you say, Megan?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think we have room for just two more questions.
Okay.
Franklin de Guzman, coming from a country where students can come from different social economic status, in your experience, is there a difference in educating citizenship, for example, in content or strategy, between those who come from affluent background and those who are impoverished?
You want to talk about a little bit about Leonard Harris, Maughn, or?
You want to start and then I'll.
Yeah, I mean, my response to this is there is a difference. Maybe not in strategy. Trying to think whether in strategy, but definitely in content. And the difference that comes to mind from my point of view, having worked with someone who was working on this, the challenging piece in coming to, in educating children who are from an affluent background is just getting them to see the injustice. Because, of course, you know, being in positions of privilege makes it much harder to see the injustice. And so complementing seeing the injustice is getting them to recognize their own ignorance. And that can be something of an uphill battle. I mean, that requires its own content. Whereas I think those who come from a less affluent background, it's not so difficult for them to see the structures and systems of injustice because they are directly impacted by it on a day-to-day basis. And so the question for them becomes about being able to talk about it, being able to acknowledge it, and then being able to, I think, collectively problem solve around it and actually move to make real change in the world. You would hope that those students who also come from affluent backgrounds, that is ultimately what you're educating them for too. But I think the hard work comes in getting them to see it first.
Yeah, I'll just mention the work of Megan Bowler, who writes about the pedagogy of discomfort, and in this way. And I think that as Megan says, the responsibility to sort of on the teacher to engage in a pedagogy of discomfort with students of privilege is different, and it's sort of like bringing in perspectives and materials and that help them confront their own privilege, which causes a discomfort, but in a good way. We want that, and the students who are not privileged will be engaging, bringing these things up, bringing these issues up, and inviting them to deliberate about them. Will invite a different kind of discomfort, like the discomfort of resentment and the discomfort of blame, and that's a whole different kind of thing to deal with. But I think they're both important, and they have to happen. And if I think a rigorous, careful, caring school context is the best place for both of those kinds of discomfort to happen.
Thank you. And for our final question from Eileen Chong. Thank you, Professors Gregory and Laverty, for a very informative and interesting lecture. My question is, What other titles of children's books would you recommend that are good materials for teaching philosophy to children? She mentions about the Velveteen Rabbit. Yeah, any recommendations?
I'll, I was going to let you, Maughn, talk a little bit about the thinking and stories and some of the work that's being done now within the Institute and how that might respond to Eileen's question.
Well, The Velveteen Rabbit is, of course, a classic children's novel book. And our institute really sort of launched the field of studying philosophy and children's literature in 1979 with a column written by Gareth Matthews, who developed an expertise in philosophy and children's literature. And Megan and I have been studying his work for quite a while. And I think, a few things we would say, like there are some things you can look out for in children's books that sort of go philosophical in different ways, like they present a thought experiment or they present a philosophical fable. I think you can deliberate about just about anything. Like even if you find let's say that a lot of children's books are just flatly ideological. Let's just face it. And they always have been, right? They try to teach a moral. They give a story and the story delivers a moral, and the moral is not really to be questioned. It's to teach, this is what you should think or believe or want. But it is possible to problematize those, to challenge those, just even if the moral of the story is very explicit, we can say, well, okay, what is it? How do we understand the moral? To what extent do we really agree with it? Is it true in all cases? Can we think of exceptions or counterexamples? To the extent we do agree with this moral, where in our lives does it manifest? Where would it be important for me to think about applying this moral? And how would it be applied? Like it's not automatically obvious how you would apply even a very explicit moral. This goes back to one of our earlier slides about the deliberative educators believe in morals, we believe in values, we believe in ideals, but we believe that they're inherently vague. It takes some intellectual work to figure out what they mean in the context of my life and my school day. How do I apply this in this particular situation? That takes some intellectual work and some moral imagination. So it's really more about the way you handle them than what the text is delivering. But I invite people to look at our Thinking in Stories. We have a website called Thinking in Stories. It's got reviews of children's books that have philosophical meaning in them and different ways that they can be used. So this is something we're very invested in.
Great.
And
thank you. Go, Megan.
I was just going to say, we really appreciate recommendations too. And I think Vaughn says that there are works of Filipino children's book writers who have deliberately incorporated P4C in their writing. So I've made a note of Bong Oris. Is that correct?
Nice.
So we thank you for the recommendation, Bon.
Thanks also, Professor.
Thank you again, Maughn, Megan, for the very rich discussion. We are so honored to have you both here. And maybe we can take a photo off with our keynote speakers. Everyone, if you could turn on your camera so that we could take a photo with our keynote speakers. Someone from the tech team, I think, would take it. John would take it.
Wow.
Wow is right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks again, Leander, Marquez, and everyone for inviting us. This was a wonderful experience. It's delightful to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank
you for
Thanks
accepting
for such
our
rich,
invitation.
wonderful questions.
Thank you, Dr. Maughn and Dr. Laverty.
So okay, we'll